When I opened my eyes, the first thing I sensed was the overpowering smell of antiseptic filling my nose. My entire body ached, as though it had been crushed, and every small movement sent waves of pain coursing through me. Squinting against the blinding white light overhead, I tried to focus, but everything seemed blurry and disorienting. Gradually, my vision cleared, revealing the sterile walls of what I assumed to be a hospital room. Lying there, surrounded by the steady hum of machinery, my mind was disturbingly blank. I searched for anything, a name, a face, a memory. But nothing came. It was as if my entire life had been erased, leaving me stranded in a dark void with no direction, no anchor. "You're finally awake." A deep, steady voice broke the silence. I turned my head, wincing at the pain, to see a man standing beside my bed. His expression was a mixture of relief and concern, his eyes steady but unreadable. Who are you?" I croaked, my throat parched, each word scraping out painfully. "My name is Jonathan," he replied with a warm but guarded smile. "I found you after your accident. Do you remember anything about what happened?" "An accident?" A flicker of something flashed in my mind, a deafening crash, a blinding light, then darkness. But it was all fragmented, just bits and pieces with no coherence. No matter how hard I tried, the details refused to align, leaving me with a vague but unsettling sense of dread. Jonathan studied me, his face sympathetic. "It's all right. You've been through a lot, and it's natural for memories to be hazy. Rest for now, your memories may return in time." Despite his reassuring words, I felt a chill of unease settle over me. Who am I? Why am I here? My mind spun with unanswered questions, and with each passing second, the fear grew sharper, more insistent. In the days that followed, Jonathan stayed by my side, helping me with even the simplest tasks. He wasn't just my caregiver, he was my only friend, the sole connection to a reality I no longer understood. He told me how he had found me lying unconscious by the side of the road during a storm, that he'd rushed me to the hospital even though he had no idea who I was. "You're a good man," I whispered to him one day as we sat talking. For a moment, a shadow passed over his face, a sadness I couldn't quite decipher. "Not really, Lucas," he said with a gentle smile. "I just believe everyone deserves a chance to heal, especially those who have lost their way." "Lucas?" I repeated, feeling a strange sensation as he spoke the name. "That's my name." He nodded, holding up a small, worn leather wallet. "I found this near you." Inside, there was an ID with the name Lucas Blackwell. "From what I could tell, you were a successful man, but I can't be sure this will help you recover any memories." Lucas Blackwell. I repeated the name in my mind, hoping it would unlock something familiar, something personal. But the name brought only emptiness. In my dreams, however, I began to see glimpses of a woman, beautiful, with cold, piercing eyes. She would lean in close, her lips moving as though she were whispering secrets only I could hear, then everything would shatter into darkness. Each time I woke up, drenched in cold sweat, but unable to grasp who she was or why I felt an inexplicable terror every time I saw her face. One day, as I sat in my hospital room, Jonathan suggested that it might be time for me to go home. "Maybe if you're back in familiar surroundings, something will trigger your memory." Though the thought unnerved me, I agreed. I knew I couldn't remain a shadow of a person forever, relying on the kindness of a stranger. Jonathan helped me gather my things, and together, we set out on the journey back to the city. In the car, I stared out the window in silence, the cityscape passing by in a blur. My heart pounded with a mixture of hope and fear, yet Jonathan sat quietly beside me, as though he understood I needed space to face my fears. Finally, we arrived at a large house that, though unfamiliar, stirred something deep within me. Jonathan looked at me with quiet encouragement. "This is where you lived, Lucas. Are you ready to go inside?" Nodding, I took a deep breath and stepped toward the door. The moment I crossed the threshold, a strange shiver ran down my spine. The house was empty, almost eerie, cloaked in an air of cold stillness as though it had been waiting for me all this time. I wandered down the hallway, my gaze scanning the walls covered with photographs. My eyes landed on a framed portrait of a woman, beautiful and haunting, her eyes filled with a calculated glint that sent a chill through me. For a brief moment, I remembered her smile, a smile that was once sweet but now seemed laced with a deadly sort of charm. At that exact moment, a voice spoke behind me. "Lucas. I can't believe you're finally home." I turned and saw the woman from my dream standing before me. She looked radiant, her eyes glistening with what seemed like genuine happiness. Yet, beneath that smile, I sensed something darker, something that set every nerve in my body on edge. An overwhelming sense of dread gripped me. This wasn't just a place I had once called home. It was a place filled with secrets I had yet to uncover, secrets that I wasn't sure I was ready to face. As I stood there, staring into her eyes, fragments of memories flickered at the edges of my mind, disjointed images that refused to take shape, yet taunting me with the feeling that I was close to remembering. She stepped forward, a soft smile spreading across her face as she reached for my hand. "It's me, Celeste," she whispered, her voice warm and inviting, but somehow, it felt like a gentle cage closing around me. "I was so worried when I heard about the accident. I didn't know if you'd survive." Her words sounded sincere, yet something in her gaze felt off, as if she were holding back, hiding pieces of the truth. Despite the nagging unease, I managed a small smile, hoping to keep up appearances. "Celeste, my wife," I said, the words tasting foreign in my mouth. I barely recognized her face, yet calling her my wife felt like uttering a strange, unfamiliar language. She nodded, her eyes shining with what appeared to be relief. "Yes, your wife," she repeated, squeezing my hand a little too tightly. "I'll help you remember everything. We'll get through this together." Just then, a man appeared in the doorway behind her. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a confident smirk on his face, he strode in as if he owned the place. When our eyes met, his expression flickered for a moment, a look of something almost sinister, before he plastered on a friendly smile and extended his hand. "Good to see you back, Lucas," he said, his grip firm and just a bit too strong. "I'm Richard. You probably don't remember, but we've been close friends for years." Something in the way he said, "close friends," sent another shiver of unease through me. I forced myself to nod, trying to push away the instinctive sense of distrust that had crept up inside. "Thank you, Richard," I replied, doing my best to sound sincere. "I guess I have a lot to catch up on." "Absolutely," Richard said smoothly. "But don't worry, Celeste and I will make sure you're taken care of." "Right, Celeste." His hand lingered a little too long on her shoulder, and she glanced at him, a barely there smile tugging at her lips. An uneasy feeling gnawed at me as I watched them exchange glances. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but there was a familiarity between them that felt unsettling. Their movements, the way they looked at each other, it was as if they shared a secret that I wasn't meant to know. Jonathan's warning echoed in my mind, "Be careful, Lucas. Not everyone you remember may be what they seem." I didn't know why, but I was certain he'd been right. As the days passed, I tried to settle into life with Celeste and Richard around, hoping that my memories would eventually return. Celeste was attentive and doting, always by my side, helping me with the little things. Yet, her every touch, every word, felt calculated, as though she were performing a role rather than being truly there for me. Richard, meanwhile, made himself at home in my life, always present, always watching. He'd often drop by unexpectedly, bringing coffee or chatting with Celeste in hushed tones whenever they thought I wasn't looking. There were moments when I would catch a glimpse of something sinister in their faces, a flash of impatience, a quick exchange of smug glances. The more I observed, the clearer it became that something was amiss. One evening, as I wandered the house, I stumbled upon a locked drawer in my office. Curious, I tugged at it, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. My gaze fell on a nearby set of keys, and after fumbling through a few, I found one that fit. Inside was a stack of papers, legal documents, account statements, and what appeared to be a will. The details were foggy, but one phrase stood out in stark clarity: in the event of my death, all assets are to be transferred to my spouse, Celeste Blackwell. My heart pounded. Why would I have prepared such a will, and why hadn't anyone told me about it? The sense of unease I'd felt around Celeste and Richard intensified, and a chilling realization crept into my mind: perhaps my accident hadn't been an accident at all. I spent the next few days silently gathering information, piecing together fragments of conversations I overheard between Celeste and Richard. Bit by bit, a horrifying picture began to take shape. They had been planning something, discussing finances, property, things that should have been my concern, not theirs. The more I learned, the clearer it became: they had wanted me out of the picture. But now that I was back, it seemed they were determined to play along, to maintain the illusion of caring, hoping I would remain oblivious. I knew I had to be careful, that any sudden move could tip them off. I was determined to bide my time, pretending to be the amnesiac husband they hoped I was, while silently gathering evidence. I would let them believe they were still in control, while I watched, listened, and planned. One night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, a strange resolve filled me. I would make sure Celeste and Richard paid for what they had done. For the life they had tried to steal, for the trust they had betrayed. But to do so, I would have to play my part perfectly. I forced myself to smile and play the role of the helpless amnesiac husband, keeping my emotions in check as I continued my quiet investigation. Each day, I grew closer to the truth, and with it, a burning desire for justice. Celeste and Richard had underestimated me, thinking I was weak and broken, a pawn in their twisted game. But as I prepared to confront the shadows of my past, I vowed that I would not be the victim they had expected. In the days that followed, I settled into the role of a confused, dependent husband, clinging to Celeste's every word and gesture as if I truly trusted her. I smiled, played along, and even pretended to find comfort in Richard's frequent visits. But in reality, every polite exchange, every quiet dinner, was a reminder of the secrets I was determined to uncover. Celeste continued her gentle, caring routine, never suspecting that I knew more than I let on. She guided me through the house, showing me rooms and objects that she said held special meaning: our wedding photo, a piece of jewelry she claimed I'd given her, letters supposedly from me to her. But none of it felt genuine. I could sense that she was selecting only the memories that would keep me docile, oblivious. Everything about her had become painfully transparent. Meanwhile, Richard maintained his role as the loyal friend, always eager to help. He seemed to be testing me subtly, watching for any flicker of recognition, any hint that I might be remembering too much. I knew he suspected nothing, but I could see his suspicion simmering beneath the surface, a readiness to act if I ever slipped up. But I wouldn't. I had to be smarter. One evening, as I was preparing for bed, I found Jonathan waiting by my door. His eyes held a weight of concern, his brow furrowed as though he knew something I didn't. He rarely visited now that I was back home, but tonight, something in his expression told me he had come with a purpose. "Lucas," he began quietly, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. "Can we talk? Alone?" I nodded, leading him to the far end of the garden, away from prying eyes and ears. The night was dark and silent, an uneasy stillness hanging in the air. I could feel the tension between us, unspoken and heavy. "Lucas," Jonathan said, his voice barely a whisper, "I'm worried about you. Do you really believe everything Celeste has told you?" I hesitated, unsure of how much I should reveal. Jonathan had been my rescuer, my friend, but I couldn't be certain of anyone's true motives, not yet. After a pause, I gave a cautious nod. Honestly, Jonathan, I said, keeping my voice steady, I don't know what to believe. But I need to find out on my own. Jonathan studied me, his face thoughtful. Just, be careful, he said. Sometimes, people closest to us can be the ones who do the most harm. There was something in his tone, an edge of regret, as though he knew exactly what he was warning me about. I wanted to press him for answers, to demand he tell me everything he knew, but I held back, sensing he wouldn't give up information so easily. Instead, I thanked him, and with a heavy look, he left, disappearing into the night. I returned to the house, my heart pounding with renewed determination. Jonathan's warning had only solidified my resolve. If I wanted the truth, I would have to dig deeper, take risks. I couldn't afford to wait for memories to resurface, I needed answers now. The next day, I began my quiet investigation in earnest. When Celeste was out, I searched every room, every drawer, looking for anything that might give me a glimpse of the truth. In her study, I found an old journal of hers, filled with entries that painted a different picture of our marriage. Her words were cold, detached, laced with frustration and resentment. I could feel her bitterness seething through each page. As though I were reading a confessional from someone who despised me. But there was one entry that stopped me cold. It read, "Soon, everything will fall into place. Lucas won't know what hit him. All those years of waiting will finally pay off." The shock of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever plan Celeste had, it had been brewing for years, a slow, calculated betrayal. I could feel my anger simmering, but I forced myself to stay calm, to remember that I had to keep playing the part of the clueless husband. There would be a time for rage, but not yet. As I sifted through more of her notes, I found references to meetings with Richard, cryptic mentions of final arrangements, and chillingly, a list of my assets and accounts, neatly catalogued. They had mapped out my entire life, dissected every piece of my existence as though it were nothing more than a blueprint for their own ambitions. I knew then that my accident had been no accident at all. It had been a carefully orchestrated plan to remove me from the picture, leaving Celeste free to claim everything I owned with Richard. By her side. But somehow, I had survived, throwing their entire scheme into disarray. And now, they were simply waiting, hoping my memory would never return, allowing them to execute their plan without consequence. But I would not let them win. Now, I had a plan of my own. The next few days, I played my part with precision. I smiled, joked, even thanked Celeste for her care, all while gathering as much evidence as I could. I made copies of her journal entries, took photos of the financial documents, and logged every suspicious interaction between her and Richard. One evening, as I pretended to doze off in the living room, I overheard a hushed conversation between them, their voices barely audible but filled with tension. "He's getting too comfortable," Richard muttered. "Are you sure he hasn't remembered anything?" "Of course I'm sure," Celeste snapped. "He's as clueless as ever. Just keep playing along. Soon, he'll be out of the way for good, and we'll have everything we deserve." Their words sent a chill down my spine. The final piece of their plan was still in motion, and I had no doubt they were growing impatient. But now, I was ready. I had everything I needed, evidence of their affair, proof of their financial schemes, and the chilling confirmation of their intentions. I would confront them, reveal the truth, but only when I had every piece in place, ensuring they could not slip through my grasp. As I lay awake that night, the weight of my plan settling over me, I realized something important: I was no longer a victim. I was a man reborn, armed with knowledge, and fueled by a thirst for justice that burned hotter than my fear. Celeste and Richard had turned my life into a twisted game, but they had underestimated me. And soon, they would learn the price of betrayal. The next few days, I worked carefully, laying the groundwork for my plan, all while pretending to be oblivious. Each morning, I greeted Celeste with a warm smile, kissed her cheek, and acted like the grateful husband she expected. I played cards with Richard, laughing along with his terrible jokes, letting him think I was the broken man he had left for dead. But I was far from broken. I was sharper than ever, each moment a study in restraint, each interaction with them an opportunity to gather more evidence. I had set up a hidden recording device in the library, where Celeste and Richard often held their secret conversations. Every whisper, every sinister glance between them, became ammunition for my final move. One evening, after a quiet dinner with Celeste, she turned to me, her eyes bright with what looked like excitement. "Lucas, I think it's time we took a little vacation," she said, her voice light, but her eyes sharp, watching me carefully. "Somewhere to help you clear your head." A vacation. My mind instantly went on high alert. I forced a smile. "A vacation? That sounds perfect," I replied, feigning enthusiasm. "Where were you thinking?" She hesitated, then quickly said, "Oh, somewhere remote, peaceful. Richard has a cabin in the mountains. It's quiet, far from everything. I think it could be just what you need." I felt a chill run down my spine. There it was, their final plan. She intended to lure me away, isolate me from any help, and finish what they had started. But this time, I was prepared. "That sounds amazing, Celeste. I trust you completely," I said, my smile widening as I felt the first taste of victory. She had no idea I was already 3 steps ahead. As the day of the vacation approached, I prepared meticulously, packing only what I needed to play my part. I had alerted Jonathan about my suspicions, and he'd agreed to follow at a distance, ready to help at a moment's notice. I couldn't risk trusting anyone fully, but Jonathan had proven himself reliable so far. The drive to the cabin was long and silent. Celeste sat beside me, her gaze distant as she looked out the window, likely rehearsing whatever lie she had prepared to cover my accident. Richard was already waiting at the cabin when we arrived, a grim smile on his face as he helped me with my bags. I returned his smile, doing my best to ignore the feeling of betrayal simmering beneath my calm facade. The cabin was as secluded as she described, a solitary structure surrounded by dense forest, far from any prying eyes. The perfect place for an accident, I thought. The 3 of us settled in, with Celeste suggesting we enjoy a quiet evening by the fire. She poured us each a glass of wine, the fire casting shadows across her face as she handed me my glass, her smile never reaching her eyes. As we sipped our drinks, Richard glanced at me, a strange, almost pitying expression on his face. I could see he was eager to be done with it, his impatience barely concealed. But I gave nothing away, maintaining my look of trust and calm. Eventually, Richard leaned forward, his tone casual but probing. "So, Lucas," he said, "how does it feel to be back?" I looked at him thoughtfully, then said, "Honestly, it's been tough. But having you both here has been a lifesaver. I don't know what I'd do without you." Richard and Celeste exchanged a quick glance, satisfaction gleaming in their eyes. I could almost see the wheels turning in their minds, certain they had me right where they wanted. Little did they know that the trap was already closing in on them. Late that night, when both of them were asleep, I took my chance. Slipping into the study, I placed the final recording device under the desk and made my way back to bed. My heart was racing, each step bringing me closer to the truth, to the moment they would finally face the consequences of their betrayal. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of hushed voices coming from the kitchen. I crept to the door, listening closely as Celeste and Richard discussed their plan, unaware that I was recording every word. "Tonight's the night," then, Celeste whispered. "Once it's done, we'll stage it as an accident. No one will ever know." Richard nodded, his voice cold and calculated. "It has to be quick. If he starts to suspect, he won't," Celeste cut him off. "He's clueless. Just play along. By tomorrow, it'll all be over, and we'll have everything." My anger burned as I listened, their words confirming every suspicion. But I forced myself to stay calm, knowing that soon, I would have everything I needed. That evening, I played my part perfectly, laughing, drinking, and letting them think they had me cornered. As we sat by the fire, I waited for the right moment, my hand on the hidden recorder in my pocket, my mind focused on the justice I was about to serve. Then, as the clock struck midnight, I stood, my gaze cold and unwavering as I looked at them both. "I know what you did," I said, my voice steady, each word cutting through the silence. Their faces went pale, shock and confusion flashing across their features. "Lucas, what are you talking about?" Celeste stammered, her voice trembling. "You think I haven't figured it out?" I replied, pulling out the recorder and pressing play. The recording of their conversation filled the room, their own voices betraying them with every word. Celeste's face twisted in horror, her mask of innocence shattering. Richard, his calm demeanor gone, lunged at me, but I was ready, stepping back and raising my phone. "I've sent everything to the authorities," I said calmly. "They'll be here soon. Your lies, your schemes, it's all over." Richard froze, his fists clenched, rage twisting his face as he realized he was trapped. Celeste's expression turned desperate, pleading. "Lucas, please, I can explain," but I shook my head, feeling only a hollow sense of finality. "Explain? You tried to kill me. You betrayed me. There's nothing left to say." At that moment, flashing lights appeared outside the cabin, the police cars pulling up just as I had planned. Celeste and Richard were taken away, their faces etched with disbelief and fury as they were led out in handcuffs. As they vanished into the night, a weight lifted from my shoulders, a sense of justice finally settling within me. I stood alone in the cabin, the silence around me strangely comforting. I had lost so much, but I had reclaimed my life, my identity, and my sense of self. Celeste and Richard would face the consequences of their actions, and I was finally free from the nightmare they had tried to trap me in. In the days following Celeste and Richard's arrest, the media exploded with the story. Headlines screamed betrayal, scandal, and tragedy, the perfect storm of drama that fed the public's fascination. But despite the noise, the whirlwind of interviews, and the invasive questions, I felt strangely calm. For the first time since the accident, I was no longer looking over my shoulder, living in a haze of mistrust. I was finally free. Jonathan stayed by my side, helping me handle the legal processes, the endless paperwork, and the court hearings. He became my rock, a quiet but steady presence that grounded me when memories and doubts threatened to resurface. Through his support, I began to understand the depth of true friendship, a friendship that had stood by me without expectation, without conditions. And for that, I was eternally grateful. As the trial began, Celeste and Richard faced the full weight of the evidence I had gathered. Their plans, their deception, even the recordings of their darkest conversations, all laid bare in front of a jury. I sat in the courtroom, watching as each piece of evidence was presented, each lie dissected and exposed. Celeste tried to portray herself as a loving wife driven to desperation by financial struggles, attempting to twist her betrayal into a narrative of survival. Richard, on the other hand, remained stoic, cold, and unrepentant, his gaze fixed forward as though he couldn't care less about the lives he had destroyed. But the jury saw through their charade. After weeks of testimony, deliberations, and tearful accounts from family and friends who had been kept in the dark, the verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. They were both sentenced to a long prison term, and as they were led out of the courtroom, I felt no satisfaction, no joy, only a sense of release. As I walked out of the courthouse for the last time, I found myself standing under a wide, open sky. I breathed in deeply, the cool air filling my lungs with a sense of renewal, a promise of life beyond the pain they had caused. I knew I would carry the scars of betrayal for a long time, but I was also determined to rebuild, to reclaim my sense of self. Time has a way of softening wounds, of turning sharp memories into distant echoes. I left the city soon after the trial, settling in a small, quiet town by the coast, far from the memories of my former life. It was there, by the sea, that I began to find myself again, piece by piece. In the evenings, I would walk along the shore, letting the rhythm of the waves soothe my mind. The ocean became my sanctuary, a place where I could shed the weight of the past, one step at a time. I started painting again, a forgotten passion from years ago. With each stroke of the brush, I felt a part of myself returning, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Jonathan visited often, our bond strengthened by the ordeal we had faced together. We spent long hours talking about everything and nothing, and slowly, he helped me open up, to look forward rather than back. His support reminded me that life, even after betrayal, was still full of promise, of second chances. One evening, as we sat on the beach, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jonathan turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, Lucas," he said, "you have a rare strength. You've come out of this stronger, more resilient. I think, maybe, it's time to forgive yourself." "Forgive myself?" I echoed, a lump forming in my throat. "For what?" "For holding on to the guilt, the shame of being deceived," he replied quietly. "Celeste and Richard, they chose their path. You had no part in their betrayal. But holding on to the pain only keeps you tied to them." His words lingered with me long after that evening. I realized that I had been carrying a quiet, unspoken guilt, as though I could have somehow prevented their treachery if I'd been a different man, a stronger husband, a more attentive friend. But Jonathan was right, I hadn't failed, they had. And it was time to release the last of their hold over me. That night, I wrote a letter to Celeste. I poured out every last bit of anger, betrayal, and disappointment I had buried inside. But as I neared the end, I realized there was nothing left to say. Instead of ending with bitterness, I wrote two final words: "I forgive you." I burned the letter, watching the flames consume my last ties to her and Richard. As the embers died, I felt a profound sense of peace, as though I had finally shed the last of the darkness they had cast over my life. Months turned into seasons, and with each passing day, I felt more alive, more certain of who I was and who I wanted to become. I had learned, through pain and betrayal, to value honesty, to cherish loyalty, and most importantly, to trust myself. One evening, while walking through the small gallery in town, I met someone, a woman named Evelyn, whose warmth and kindness felt like a balm to my soul. She had her own scars, her own history of heartbreak, but there was a quiet strength in her that drew me in. We began to spend time together, sharing our stories, our laughter, and slowly, she became a part of the new life I was building. With her, I found a sense of healing I hadn't thought possible. Together, we embraced the beauty of second chances, the promise of love rebuilt from the ashes of our pasts. And though I would never forget the lessons I had learned, I knew that my heart had found peace, a peace that no betrayal could ever take away. As we stood on the beach one evening, watching the waves roll in, I realized that I was no longer haunted by the shadows of my past. I had reclaimed my life, found love again, and emerged from the darkness stronger than ever. In the end, I was not defined by Celeste's betrayal, nor by Richard's cruelty, but by the strength I had found to rise above it all. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the water, I knew that my story was far from over. I had found redemption, hope, and a future worth living for.